Well, here is Al Osborne back again. So now that you've had an introduction to the three main types of innovations, we can begin to think now about disruptive innovation in the larger sense, taking advantage of Clay Christensen's big insights, if you will, and his concepts on what it looks like to industry over time that is enjoying mainstream success in the face of what can be viewed as a disruptive technology. Technologies like this rarely hit you like lightning, but when they do strike, they might as well have been lightning because they will disrupt. And the presence then of these disruptive technologies is critical to how industry advances and meets the needs, emerging needs of customers. Now, let us begin by thinking about what a disruptive technology actually looks like. The first thing I want to say right here, it is simpler and cheaper, and very often its performance is not as good as what has been established by in the way of benchmarks or standards in the mainstream markets. So relative to what's established, it isn't nearly as good. And in fact, it is not even nearly as profitable. The disruptive technology may have lower margins, and it may, in fact, not even higher profits. So from a business proposition, it doesn't appear promising. In fact, it might seem unpromising. Unpromising because the leading firms in the industry, most profitable customers, don't want, cannot use, and generally do not want to be bothered with an unpromising new technology. They are happy with what's being provided. In fact, mainstream markets often avoid and ignore these promising technologies. And it usually is in some emerging or insignificant niche market that these technologies are first commercialized and first brought to the eyes of consumers. Now, Christensen's thesis is very important here because these technologies are often ignored by very well-managed companies. And very well-managed companies fail because they're, in fact, well-managed. Now, isn't this a bit of a puzzle? They are doing very well by managing their business in the mainstream market with accepted standards and benchmarks, and all of a sudden, there's this potential disruption. How can we make sense of these ideas? What actually is directly happening? Well, this then, as you see, poses a dilemma. And the dilemma is, how do I, as a business person now, deal with this emerging niche opportunity when in fact I'm enjoying tremendous success in my mainstream market? How do I begin to adopt that? How does it interfere with what it is that I'm doing? Can I find a way to make that work, or do I totally ignore it? And the dilemma, of course, is ignoring it can be fatal. The solution then is not to ignore it, but find a way in which you can, through with your own way of innovating, perhaps adopting Christensen's innovator's DNA, is one way of finding a solution when disruption presents itself in your marketplace. Take a moment to look at the graphic here for a second. Why do we not see these emerging opportunities as a successful business? Why are we busy doing what we're doing and not paying attention to what may be an opportunity for growth and future success? Well, the dilemma is that a successful business is doing the right thing by focusing on its customers and on the business segment, and in doing so, it may well miss the sliver of opportunities that could be available to it on the periphery of the mainstream market. Those slivers may be the ones that produce the future, where the totally new growth opportunities can be discovered. But there may not be much there to start out with. Nothing that may be there from your point of view could be something transformational. the periphery can often become core, and it is being able to recognize those that moves you beyond just sustaining innovation with your most profitable businesses to recognizing what may be at the core, that sliver that could be central to future business survival. One way of thinking about this is to thinking about paradigms. Because mainstream business activity exists with a business model, an approach to working. I call that a paradigm. But the reality, if there's a paradigm shift and you are not aware of that shift, your success, even in sustaining innovation, guarantees nothing from a future point of view. So if we tend to be too busy or distracted by running our current businesses, we have to be sensitive to innovations. Or better yet, we need to be hunting them down. We need to feel uneasy about what we're doing so that we can be prepared, if you will, to deal with a paradigm shift. Feeling uneasy drives us to be aware of new options. In being aware of new options, we're willing to test new models or new approaches to thinking about things. This then allows us to suspend our judgment about what it is that we're doing and get to fundamental change that may be necessary from our point of view to create success. This then allows us in time to reject the old paradigm and embrace a new paradigm. This process of paradigm shifting is not unusual, but it is not easy to do. And if one does not exist in an industry where there's turbulence and change, one may not be familiar with the mental gymnastics that may be necessary to make things work. Let's take a moment to look at some historic shifts in paradigms. Some of these examples may help you. We're all familiar, for example, with Newtonian mechanics and the apple that fell on Sir Isaac Newton's head as an illustration of gravity. Well, this is perhaps one of the first lessons we have in physics. Newtonian mechanics is one way of describing things. Gravity falling. But over time, there were other ways of thinking about things. And Einstein came up with the notion of E equals mc squared, which was another paradigm shift for physicists in thinking about energy and matter and how they relate to one another. Not shortly after that, one had to think about black holes. And beyond black holes, one had to think about black holes having energy. And black holes having energy led us simply to the notion of quarks. So you can see, at least in physics, there was historic important paradigm shifts. These are the same kind of paradigm shifts that can occur in marketplaces. And we have to be ready to give up the old paradigm and be willing to accept new ways of knowledge, new ways of frameworks, new mental attitudes in dealing with things. That, to me, is the essential essence of Christensen's thesis. Let's now look at Christensen's graph and think about how this notion of paradigm shifts and embracing new innovations might actually work from the point of view of over time and performance as expected. This graph denotes first the performance that might be demanded by the very best customers in a marketplace. This could be the high-end automobile market, for example, or it could be historically a market like made famous by disk drives or vacuum tubes. This is an existing performance that's been expected over time. And that particular performance may not be aware of an emerging set of technologies at the periphery. And this may be the performance, therefore, the second red line, demanded by the low end of the market. Now, progress from sustaining innovations with the performance demanded is described by this blue line. And progress, therefore, requires incumbents to continue to develop and innovate. We've called these sustaining innovations. And in a market in which incumbents or understand what's going on at the high end of the market, they're able to therefore sustain their innovations and meet the demands of performance required by their best customers. Now, that simply means that if there's all of a sudden a new paradigm shift, as been described by this second blue line, notice where progress from this disruptive innovation takes place very slowly. It is not at all essential, but at some point in time, this progress catches up, and it is truly disruptive. And this disruption can take place, if you can see this, where it crosses the performance that might be expected. Notice that it is not even being adopted by incumbents, and therefore what we see here is that at some point in time, this disrupted innovation is the preferable innovation, and entrants therefore become the dominant supplier and will nearly always win eventually at the high end of the market. Progress from a disruptive technology takes time, but when it does occur, it is purely transformational. But you can see, just from looking at this graph, just how long it might take for successful incumbents and suppliers to those markets to even think that the progress of a disruptive innovation makes economic sense. The technology takes place at the periphery, but in looking at the mainstream market, which is really what defines the size of the business from an economic point of view, it takes a while to mature because the periphery is still too small to be economically successful. Well, with that dilemma and understanding that process, one has to figure out how they harness disruptive technology. And to succeed in harnessing disruptive technologies, one needs to develop a set of principles. And these have been defined by Christensen. And what I'd like to do is share what some of these are with you. The first one is pay attention. Simply start early before the mainstream business is affected by the technology. That is to say, pay attention to the periphery. And if you have the resources, create a standalone organization outside of and unaffecting your mainstream business with the appropriate resources that might be necessary to explore what might be going on at the periphery. And make no mistake, this innovation is a threat. But in that threat is hidden an opportunity, especially if this opportunity holds the promise of new growth or a market that you didn't know about. By paying attention to the periphery, you turn what could be a threat into a real opportunity and a source of future value creation. It might be appropriate for us at this point to review Christensen's principles as he has described them as the basis for how we should think about disruption. Let's remember that organizations must depend on customers and investors for resources. That in and of itself requires that you pay attention to those mainstream businesses. Second, because of the demands of a larger company and your growth imperatives, you don't pay attention to small markets. Small markets don't necessarily solve the growth needs of a large company. You have a dominant market share, sustaining innovations, doing exactly what your customers have asked you to do, seems in the near term a reasonably successful strategy, and it is. So you don't pay attention to what the small markets are all about. In truth, the analytical and infrastructure apparatus of large organizations make it such that the analysis that you might do about markets and emerging trends is simply not available. Peripheral markets don't exist in any size and shape that you can get the data you need to be comfortable in analyzing the potential. And technology supply may not equal market demand, and it may take a long time before the disruptive technology matures enough to be acceptable, if you will, to the mainstream market, what occurs as a periphery needs to be validated at the mean of the mainstream business. Now, let's take the example of a company like Netflix. Here is, you may know this to be the organization that provides you movies in various forms over recent years. And here's a history of its subscriber growth. Look how rapid this has been, with tremendous growth in the last 3 or 4 years. Of course, at one time, Netflix did not exist as a significant company. How did Netflix develop this particular ability? Well, it find a way at the periphery of an existing business to be able to become the mainstream business. Some of you may be familiar with the real estate-driven operation of a company called Blockbuster. Blockbuster was where people would go to rent their videos, or their DVDs, as it were, over time, from tape to DVD. Netflix thought that there was a business here, and Blockbuster, therefore, was its major rival throughout some 10 years or so. And they proceeded to offer an alternative way to innovate in a channel. So instead of having to go to a store to get your DVD or your video, they agreed to provide it to you in the mail using the U.S. postage. That innovation in of itself dealt with the convenience factor that was important to customers, and that fueled subscriber growth for Netflix. Now, but that was not enough. Netflix also realized over time that there were other things, given the competitive reaction, that may be important. And one particular change had to deal with file sharing and the availability of streaming video. Netflix realized that it could deliver the content that people wanted with their movies, instead of through the mail with compact discs. They delivered that content online. The delivery online essentially destroyed the mainstream business of Blockbuster. And through this innovation, Netflix enjoyed tremendous further subscriber growth, as described on the chart before you. So you see two important technical innovations, paradigm shifts, if you will, accelerated Netflix off the periphery into the mainstream, and the mainstream businesses could not adjust in a way so was sufficient to justify their survival. And today the main competitor is not Netflix is not Blockbuster, but in fact the cable companies and others who themselves are trying, through another innovation called video on demand, to be able to compete, therefore, with the streaming video of Netflix. Now, this industry will continue to evolve in all of the 10 areas we talked about earlier on, whether it's channels or finance, whether it's inside or outside. All of that is going to be important to the future. But here's what this market leader is able to do. First of all, you hire the right people. These are some of the lessons we can take away. You understand the customer's pain. Notice that this first started in this example by being aware about the convenience factor, then being aware about the way in which it should be delivered, then being aware of how technology made it easier for people to be at home getting their videos. Maintaining an awareness of what's going on the periphery, whether it was a different method of distribution or a different technology, or whether it's video on demand. It's understanding how these things could affect your business. And then, knowing what these were, being cognizant and agile enough to try to iterate and learn and adapt, rather than resist change, being comfortable with accepting the paradigms through experimentation. So you have the right people. You understand how your customers' pain is changing. You're willing to work at the periphery and learn from the periphery even before it becomes mainstream through experimentation. Avoiding, therefore, the follies of imitation and brand dilution allows you to be successful because you can know and use the collateral assets that you have, the content married together with the distribution channel, for example, are two ways in which the collateral technology is useful to your success. Another perspective on this Netflix phenomena can be understood by looking at the music industry that we talked about before. In this chart on your right, you would observe a rapid increase in the number of units sold. This is through the new file sharing techniques for the distribution of music. Now, this is occurring rapidly in number of units at the periphery, but that very same result may result in a number of shipments, but revenues may not be growing yet. And that is one of the dilemmas that is posed by the steep upswing in units sold, but at the same time, because prices have fallen, to introduce this subject, we see that revenues go down. This is not unlike what is also happening in the video business, and all of this is just to say that this is the essence of how the dilemma and how it must be resolved can move forward. So what then is the entrepreneur's DNA to assist in this process? Well, first of all, you must have what I'm going to call the courage to innovate. You're willing to challenge existing ways of doing things, and you're not afraid to take the risks that might be necessary. The organization must have the behavioral skills to experiment, to question, to observe, to put together the networks that allow you to handle the challenges you face, and develop what we call associational thinking, the ability to synthesize novel inputs that may be occurring in your marketplace and see what those trends might be so that the light bulbs go off in your head. That is what the essence of the entrepreneur's DNA is, as developed by Christensen and his colleagues. And so, key goals and questions that you want to turn to right here, right, is how do you go after success? You drive it, you don't impede it. How do you increase the probability that you'll be successful? Well, pay attention to what's going on at the low end of the market. Ask yourself, is this another sustaining, or could this potentially be a disruptive innovation? And very often, if it's at the periphery, it's going to be disruptive. You must grow profitably, therefore, from the foothold that you may have established at the periphery, and develop the people that will buy the product through understanding this iteration in using some of the principles we developed earlier on in minimum valuable offers, if you would, minimal viable offers, if you will, to the marketplace. Continue experimenting and testing with those initial customers that you hope to win over. Non-consumers are those that aren't right now in the mainstream, but you're developing them as likely customers, and they will be the ones that take you, perhaps, to the center at some time. Maintaining sustainable growth is not easy. You must learn how to balance both internal and external factors as you try to adapt the innovations that might be necessary. But by all costs, avoid commoditization. Don't be a would-be or an imitative or the same company or product. Innovate. One of the problems in an organization is innovating in communication, understanding how we all work together in a seamless way to produce value. And when you do that, you have a much more solid structure and the processes in place and the values to support the mission and goals you're trying to achieve. Build then effective emergent technologies. Think about the models. How do you validate them as you try to put the resources that are necessary to assure product innovation? You know the processes that we've talked about. Now it's a question then of pulling together the resources, human and non-human, to launch early emergent technologies on your way to sustaining innovation and building the kind of commitment you need in your organization to make things happen. We call this the tone of the top. It's important that the leaders in the organization be able to think that disruption is how they'll find their future, manage the tensions, and remain, as we have said, ambidextrous, thinking about tomorrow while being successful today. We've tried to help you in this process of being successful today. Let me summarize our key concepts. We talked about the dilemma. We talked about the solution. And we talked about what it needs to develop the innovator's DNA. The disruptive technologies come in three forms: empowering, sustaining, and those that promote efficiency. But mainstream incumbent companies can win in markets for which the innovations are primarily sustaining. But those companies face a dilemma and have to try to find a solution when there are paradigm shifts and innovative technologies at the periphery of what they do best. It is important for us to keep these principles in mind as we think about how we can build viable entrepreneurial organizations.